Our next speaker is none other than Farzana Baduel, the CEO of Curzon PR. She has a long list of achievements and awards, which I'll try to get through. So as well as being CEO of a globally focused PR consultancy, Farzana has been appointed as the resident public relations expert and ambassador for the Oxford Foundry, the University of Oxford's Entrepreneurship Centre. As a passionate advocate of strategic communications, she champions the power of PR as a dynamic force for building bridges and unifying the world's voices into a global narrative. She set up Curzon PR in 2009, having previously served as Vice Chair of Business Relations at the UK Conservative Party. Farzana is a PR expert working across government, corporate, consumer, and arts and culture. She is both chartered at the Institute of Public Relations and holds a fellowship at the Chartered Institute of Marketing. She regularly lectures around the world and is a media commentator on PR, diversity, and women leadership. She has won awards including Entrepreneur of the Year, Businesswoman of the Year at the Muslim Awards, Entrepreneur of the Year at the Asian Woman of Achievement Awards, and Media Professional of the Year at the AMA Awards. Farzana will be presenting on Purposeful Capitalism, Driving PR's Integration with Marketing. And we can't wait to hear what she has to say. Farzana, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. God, it's lovely to have somebody doing my PR like that. Okay, so I'm really excited about this talk because it's something that has been rumbling in the back of my mind for quite a long time, as I've been in public relations for 10 years. Prior to that, I was an accountant, so yes, a bit of a segue from tax returns to press releases. And I've watched the sort of the integration between PR and marketing over the last 10 years, and I've been quite fascinated by it. And what I wanted to do today is, there's been a lot of incredible speakers lined up for the agenda today who are going to talk about how they're integrating and the impact and so forth. And what I wanted to do is really talk about the why and bring in a little bit of sort of the recent history, in terms of the recent journey of marketing, the recent journey of PR, and kind of bridge it together in terms of what are the drivers that are really driving the integration between PR and marketing. And I thought that would be quite useful and quite interesting to just, take a bit of a sort of a deeper look at the recent history. If we understand, the past, of course, we're more insightful in terms of understanding the present with a view to understanding what may happen next. Okay, so purposeful capitalism. So, what is purposeful capitalism? And there's many different, other phrases that people use interchangeably, such as stakeholder capitalism, conscious capitalism, inclusive capitalism. And, in essence, what it really is, it's really trying to move away from the capitalism that was purely in pursuit of profit for the shareholders, and kind of moving into a more sort of inclusive form of capitalism where actually it's not just the stakeholders' interests that capitalism has to address, but also the other stakeholders, from the employees to the communities to the environment. So it's really that sort of balance of people, profit, and planet. And it fascinates me. So I hope you'll find the presentation interesting. Now, the first slide that I wanted to show you was really trying to try and tell a story. So here it goes. Once upon a time, not so long ago, there lived two magical realms side by side: the realm of marketing and the realm of public relations. I'm just trying to move this storybook page. Now, here we go. King of marketing. Now, that picture actually shows the confidence and the power of marketing, and it's embodied in, obviously, Don Draper, who I was slightly obsessed with when Mad Men came out. Now, what happened in terms of marketing? Why was marketing so confident? And it was because in the recent history, brands were primarily focused upon one stakeholder, and that stakeholder was the customer, the consumer. And of course, the customer is the focus domain of marketing. And as a consequence, marketers also enjoyed multi-channel access across print, broadcast, and as well as out of home. And so what we saw happening with marketing is that that they had the lion's share of the budget. And of course, when you have a lion's share of the budget, you then sort of assume that power position. Now, because they had the lion's share of the budget, they also therefore controlled a lot of the strategy and the creative lead. And they also were lucky because they had access to data to hone their craft. And, they had access to data from buying data, media reach, supermarket data. And they also had complete control in the sense that they could control where their message was going to be put. And obviously, that's a different story for public relations originally when they were primarily focused on media relations. The control was really with the editor. Then we have the 4 Ps of marketing, and of course, doesn't include public relations. And public relations was often an afterthought. And when public relations were engaged, they were often brought in at the last stage for pure tactical implementation. Now, I experienced that. So, I started off about 10 years ago, and I remember, being brought in by sort of, by marketing folks. And, it was almost as if they sort of, we had sort of strategic ideas, but they just weren't interested. And it was very much like, no, darling, we've done all the strategy. Can you just knock out a little press release? And they wouldn't, and it was almost a dismissive attitude that I personally experienced. And so I used to always look at sort of, marketing people as, this sort of princely realm. We were sort of like poor cousins as PR because we just didn't have the budgets that they had. We therefore didn't have the ability to be in the strategy room. We didn't have the ability to take the creative lead. And we had very sort of restricted channels. So that's kind of, the marketing recent history in terms of the reasons why they had that level of clout. And it was primarily because the stakeholder of note was always the customer. Now, if we go to the next slide, it's going to talk a bit more about PR and the recent history of public relations. So there, of course, we have the absolutely fabulous duo. And so what happened with public relations is they really struggled with legitimacy. And the reasons why they struggled were a multitude of reasons. So, of course, it was harnessed by Edward Bernays. It was a nephew of Sigmund Freud in the 1920s. He mastered the art of persuasion via third-party endorsement. And, public relations was really a blend of psychology and of advocacy. And psychology, was actually dismissed by a large number of people because it was a recently new profession. And so likewise, public relations that sort of sat on psychology, they both were relatively new professions, and therefore they weren't really taken seriously. They didn't really have the body of evidence and then therefore the credibility. And so they often struggled in terms of trying to be taken seriously. And so as a consequence, also on top of that, public relations had very limited channels at their disposal. So obviously, events, lobbying, and media relations, and they had very patchy access to data as well to justify their return on investment. So they were very much sort of on a back foot compared to their marketing peers. Now, obviously, what we then saw happening is there was a bit of a stereotype about public relations, that it was fluff, because if you can't have the data, you can't justify the ROI. There was a bit of sort of psychobabble that people are quite condescending towards, and they sort of think, our PRs as people who do boozy lunches and, valued solely for their column inches in media coverage. And a lot of clients, even I remember 10 years ago, clients would assess our value in terms of, okay, actually it'll cost me X amount to get a page in this newspaper. And if I pay your retainer and you get it, well, is that sort of justified? And there was no sort of understanding and thinking about, third-party endorsement and the fact that, and an editorial has more value than an advertising page because of third-party endorsement from the, from the journalist and also the media outlet, and the sort of concept and understanding of influence and social proof. And so it was very difficult in those days for public relations, and even today, actually, public relations is often misunderstood, and the term is often interchangeably used with media relations. And media relations is one aspect of public relations, is one channel, but often people sort of equate it to public relations. So what happened next? So that was basically the reality for a lot of PR people, and especially for me when I first came into the industry. Then we had a very, very different experience that happened. We basically saw channel proliferation. And what that basically means is all these new channels started coming up. So you had, in the early days, I remember the internet, obviously dial-up modem. We then started having websites as a channel for communications. Then obviously the social media platforms as a channel for communications. And then the millennials with their sort of attitudinal shifts and their sort of their need for their need for understanding why they are buying, and also they wanted to align their spend with their values. So that was very interesting for the industry. And then of course you then had search engines, that you had this sort of online reputation piece that came through. Then broadband obviously facilitated a lot of video as formats, and then obviously smartphones as well. Changed the way that we consume data. The rise of the bloggers, apps, more social media platforms, influencers, podcasts, even more social media platforms, Generation Z turns out, webcast, virtual reality and augmented reality. The last two obviously, is yet to sort of hit us in a big way. Now, what that actually shows is actually just relatively recently, look at what has happened. Look at all these different channels that had just proliferated. And actually, all these different channels, actually, there's a deeper meaning to the proliferation of these channels. It actually changed the way marketing and PR interact. And I'll explain why. Other than making us work harder because of the fragmented media landscape. What happened after that is the multitude of communication channels. It gave actually PR people access to actually having a multi-channel approach to navigate the landscape. Also, what was really critical is PR finally had access to data because of the digital channels, which gave us legitimacy, because then we could actually sort of explain why we're doing it and how it works and what the impact is, and look at outcomes and not just outputs. Psychology also evolved, and research-based evidence was widely accepted, championing the science of persuasion, behavioral neuroscience, developed theories that were widely embraced by governments and organizations worldwide. Of course, we all know about the nudge theory and so forth. And then what happened is the balance of power, interestingly, moved from a small nexus of power brokers who controlled traditional media to the public. And that's a huge shift that happened because, when I was growing up, we had a couple of broadcast channels, a couple of, print, and so they really did control, the communication channels. But then all of a sudden, all of these new channels, it resulted in a lot of people actually becoming broadcasters themselves, and very sort of low barriers to entry to communicate. So what happened? Brands started to engage in dialogue directly with the public, which was really quite interesting because brands really weren't that used to engaging directly with the public, other than a few focus groups, perception audits and what have you, and experiential events. So when they started engaging with the public, all of a sudden, these voices started to gain momentum of previously unheard of stakeholders, and they took to social media to speak out. So all of a sudden, before, the focus was primarily on customers in terms of stakeholders, but all of a sudden you started hearing these voices of employees venting about their bosses, unfair supply chain practices were uncovered. Local communities adversely affected by environmental damage started speaking out, taking pictures, posting, it going viral. And it raised an incredible level of awareness. Industry bodies, they called out rogue companies for poor practice. So what started happening is the public started to speak as well, because before it was very sender-driven communications, and then we started having actually two-way communications, and in the two-way communications that was facilitated by all the multitude of channels that had low barriers to entry for the public to speak out. What happened is the public, they actually held a mirror to brands, and they realized that the collective power to shame brands and companies into doing the right thing is incredibly powerful. And so therefore, for the first time in our history, brands started to invite PRs into the strategy room, because they then ended up lurching from one reputational crisis to another. And I remember, over the years, all of a sudden, brands were absolutely terrified when they were called out on social media, by an unhappy customer or, a disgruntled former employee, and so it was absolutely fascinating. So for the first time, the brand started really thinking, actually, we need to move away from being center-driven to really being audience-driven. So what happened is they started to listen. And what they realized when they started to listen is that people care about how a brand treats other stakeholders, that somebody who is a consumer is also an employee, is also part of a community, also cares for the environment that they live in, and also cares for other people in the family of humanity. And so what they realize is actually the consumer doesn't only care about product, price, place, and promotion. They also care about how the brand treats the planet and treats people. And so what therefore happened is unheard stakeholders rose in prominence and influenced consumer perceptions. So as you can see, that's a bit of a sort of a stakeholder sort of analysis that shows that the people that brands originally cared for, which were primarily the customers, started to really widen. And so this really helped public relations, because all of a sudden public relations obviously is focused upon a multitude of stakeholders apart from just the customer. So therefore, that really helped public relations to rise in prominence and to be invited into the strategy room. And so, coupled with the fact that we had, a sort of increased breadth of communication channels that we could use, we had access to data, psychology was, sort of taken seriously, and so was, and then the balance of power started, to shift a bit. Now. That led to a very interesting time where public relations collided with marketing. Now, on the slide, I've got a very interesting tweet that I just saw a couple of days ago from the chairman of Coca-Cola. And what he talks about there's no place for racism in the world, and there's no place for racism on social media. And the Coca-Cola company will pause paid advertising on social media platforms globally for at least 30 days. We'll take time to reassess our advertising policies to determine whether revisions are needed. We also expect greater accountability and transparency from our social media partners. Now, that is absolutely fascinating, because here you have a brand that is pausing on its marketing on a social media channel because of the brand wanting to really own up to the fact that it's money being spent in social media channels that are not taking the initiative to clean up their act, that they are becoming more activist. So really what you had is the proliferation of communication channels led to more consumer activism, and then that is now being sort of moved over to brands, that brands are now being activists in itself. So that's a really interesting example of how PR is colliding with marketing. And as consumer behavior is increasingly shaped by activism, a brand's relationship with a wider stakeholder set shapes by decision-making. Now, research obviously has shown that consumers are increasingly buying based upon shared values and good corporate behavior towards stakeholders, including employees, communities, and government. And what was really interesting about what happened during the during the COVID crisis is a lot of companies were falling over themselves to communicate not any sort of commercial marketing messages. They quite rightly felt it wasn't appropriate. But they still really talking about taking care of their employees and really trying hard to ensure that they are seen as being sort of good custodians. So you saw the rise of the employee stakeholder being prominent in messaging coming in from brands. And that really just reinforces and underlines how the stakeholder focus is no longer just the customer, but is also other stakeholders such as employees and so forth. So what's happening is obviously the millennials and Generation Z are sort of reframing the consumer narrative, and they're using technology to mobilize movements for social justice and climate change by enlisting brands in their quest for a better world. So it's actually really fascinating because, I do believe in tech for good, and of course it's all about intent. But what you're seeing is collectively people are coming together and they really do want governments to work with corporates and brands and NGOs collectively to really build a better world for them. And they're doing that by really wielding a number of tools at their disposal. One tool is the ability to collectively shame brands from not doing the right thing, and their ability to speak out when a brand is not doing the right thing. And so they're really mobilizing all of these sort of great actors in our society, business, media, and government, to actually take action. So it's actually quite fascinating. What that's really led to now is a sort of is obviously the consumer activists. Now, when they buy, their behavior has shifted. So it's not just about product, price, place, and promotion. They also care about purpose. And they've become a lot more savvy because of the access to information. So for them, it's not just about them, thinking, is this a company that actually is looking after planet, people, profits? They're also even going deeper and looking at their supply chain. So, of course, recently you had in the news information about Boohoo and how they were underpaying people under the minimum wage in factories in Leicester. And Boohoo said, well, actually, they're not a direct factory of ours. They may supply to us, but they're not a direct factory towards us. And actually, the public sentiment was that we don't care. You have to ensure that not only is your company ethical, but your supply chain also is ethical. So, so there's a greater demand for good corporate behaviour, and it doesn't just stop in your sort of immediate circle of your own company. Is actually wider, going down supply chains. And of course, we also heard about companies like Apple and so forth with their factories that they outsourced in various countries, and the need for them to take ownership to clean up their supply chain. And here, of course, you have, you've got Greta Thunberg. I think you can just about see her hat, and her entourage talking about planet over profit. And of course, a lot of us initially think, well, maybe this is just Gen Z, maybe this is just millennials, but actually, it really is. It's like a ripple effect, and it's really affecting other people's attitudes and behaviour. So what you have is, you have people from different generations that are also campaigning. And what you have is initially what was a fringe sort of activism has now moved incredibly fast into mainstream. And so the sort of drive for social justice, for being a positive force in our environment, and also the drive for empathy and kindness has gone from fringe to mainstream. And so, what we have is really thinking about we know that there is a huge shift happening in consumer behavior, and that is leading marketing and PR people to work closely together, as well as PR people being invited into the strategy room, because of course, because of our ability to horizon scan and understand human behavior, we often are brought in now before a campaign is launched, so that we can do a bit of a risk assessment in terms of how could it potentially be perceived by the public or groups of the public. So what is the future? Now, that's a picture of my daughter. I don't really do child labour in the office, but I didn't have a nanny that time. She's basically, I put a picture of her there, and I did it because I asked her the other day, I said to her, do you want me to get you a pair of trainers? And I said, what about, Nike, And she said, oh, no, Mama, I don't really want to buy trainers from Nike because I heard that they use little children in their factories. And I don't know where she got that from. That could be an old story, that she found on the internet. She's older now. She's 12 years old. And so it was fascinating because, here she's a sort of, 11-year-old girl, and she doesn't want to buy into a brand because she's worried about the supply chain and the ethics around it. And I remember when I was her age, I had no concept whatsoever. I just thought if it's cool and cool people wear it, I want to wear it. But, we have it, and she isn't even Generation Z. She's a whole new generation that's coming up. So I think, the future is heightened sense of social justice, a heightened sense of environmental awareness, and the sort of uncompromising consumer perspective that brands have to be purposeful. And the public aren't just voting with their pound or their dollar. They are also taking their talent and using it to leverage for a better world. So they're saying, well, I don't want to work with this company if you're doing harm. And then that even goes on to agencies who are now worried about the reputational risk of working with brands that are perceived by some members of the public as being unethical. So there is a huge change that is happening. And obviously, the sender-driven to audience-driven, increasingly so, and also we're witnessing a shift where the influenced, i.e. the public, are becoming the influencer. Because back in the day, small nexus of media channels were really influencing, and there was no ability for the public to really talk back. And now they are actually, it's a role reversal. They are becoming the influencer. They're the ones who are telling us, or telling brands what to do, how to do it, and how to change. And that's driven by the increasing awareness and sophistication of them. And they're even beginning to realize about having a backlash against data harvesting, about hacking humans, and they're shaping a whole new world order by wielding their consumer spend, their talent, employment, and coordinating reputational attacks on brands that do not share their values. And ultimately, the culture wars have begun, and so it'll be an interesting time for the future.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Farzana, for sharing your expertise and experience with us today on a really, really important topic. I personally love the phrase purposeful capitalism, and I think that this balance between people, planet, and profit, and the emphasis on ethics and activism is just going to become more and more important for business. So we'll now be fielding a couple of audience questions. The first one is, COVID has seen many media houses reduce staff and closing publications. How would you say PR should adapt to remain relevant?
Well, I think it's, first of all, public relations is not just media relations. And increasingly, if you look at the CIPR released a report on the state of PR yesterday, it shows that media relations is increasingly a diminishing part of public relations. It is just a channel. It is not public relations. I think what's happening to journalism is incredibly sad. I was very sad to hear about what happened with the job losses in The Guardian. And it's and I think public relations has benefited, sadly, as well as suffered from the demise of traditional media. It suffered because fundamentally it is an important channel for third-party endorsement, and there are, increasingly less journalists and more public relations, and I think we're a poorer world, without journalism. I think we've benefited in the sense that a lot of journalists have actually left journalism and come into public relations. And I've worked with a lot of journalists over the years who've made that segue, and they have taught me so much about storytelling. And they have also, and they've also, brought in brand journalism. And so they have really helped public relations sort of up their game in terms of writing in a compelling way, not in a sort of overtly salesy way. I think it is very depressing. And unfortunately, as brands get better and better in terms of creating content, the appetite for the public to pay for content is diminishing, not taking into account the fact that brand journalism is self-interested, whereas journalism from traditional media, is really defending the public and an important part of democracy. So I think is incredibly sad. And other than having sort of paywalls and so forth, it's just going to make it even more difficult in the future. And I think BBC licenses are under threat and so forth. I think it's really depressing, and I think it will be damaging. But it's difficult to change human behavior in getting them to actually pay for content because of some notion of upholding democracy. So we have to think of a better way to tell the story of the importance of people paying for good journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Then we have quite an interesting question. How do you see psychology impacting new trends in PR and communications?
I think psychology is the underpinning of public relations, and no matter how many new sort of communication channels come into our sort of toolkit, human psychology doesn't always shift. However, saying that, there is a lot of neuroscience evidence that shows the actual impact of social media on the brain. And I think there's a lot of interesting information out there that shows how, unfortunately, certain aspects of social media can be incredibly manipulative and can really sort of trigger dopamine highs, through having sort of notifications coming on or, and likes. And I think there is an impact of certain communication channels, like certain social media channels, that have an impact upon mental health and the wiring of the brain. I think the way that we need to deal with it is for the public to become more aware of how they can be hacked as humans. I think we all seem to think that we have control over ourselves and what we do, but I think there's a lot of psychologists out there who have done a lot of work on the impact of technology on the human brain. And actually, we have to understand that we have the conscious and we have the subconscious, and there's behaviors that we do that we're not even conscious about, but which actually, which are manipulated by certain aspects of social media channels. But I think, the public is becoming increasingly aware of that, and sort of asking social media channels to step up.
And then there are several companies that have come under fire for inauthentic activism. How do we make sure we're communicating in a really transparent way?
Well, I think people, again, I think it's wonderful how the public are just becoming increasingly sophisticated. And that is because of the information that they can access. And what's happening is for instance, when I remember Pride, last year, everywhere I went, I mean, they just had the Pride colours. You went into a bank and they had the Pride colours, and you went into a shoe shop or a grocer, and everyone was talking about how they support Pride. And then I remember looking at the statistics, and the organisation that sort of organises Pride, they had a tiny donation sort of revenue from corporates, and most people were just using it, and it just became sort of just a sort of a inauthentic way of jumping on the bandwagon, but not actually allocating resources or making any shifts in change or policy that supports the underlying mission. So people are calling people out for greenwashing, for clean washing now during COVID, where people are talking about, oh yes, we wash our hands 3 times a day, come to our shop. So I think people are just increasingly sophisticated in calling people out. And so what's happening is, as PRs, when we work with our clients, we really, really do sort of dig deep and ensure that it isn't just an empty, jumping on the bandwagon type thing, but actually putting their money where their mouth is and coming up with real change. So it's really, and also some brands, what I see, are actually doing the action first, and then they're talking about it, rather than just talking about it and then maybe a year later being shamed into doing some sort of action because they've been called out for jumping on a bandwagon.
Absolutely. And then another audience question is, do you think that, or what do you think the role of social media influencers is in purposeful capitalism?
Well, I think it's, obviously social media influencers are incredibly an interesting part of the change that's taking place. And so, for instance, you had, in the beginning, people just thought, oh, they're just there to sort of, get free shampoo or get freebies and talk about it on Instagram. But absolutely, they are completely changing a lot in our society. So if you look at the recent, I think Trump was due to hold a big rally in the US, and on social media, the influencers actually grouped together and said, well, let's actually go and pretend that we're going to get the tickets and then just not turn up. And so you've got them sort of going into politics, and then that obviously hit the news. And so it's absolutely fascinating what they're doing. They are moving, into purposeful capitalism, as well as moving into the political domain as well, and they're making real change. And I think it will be increasingly interesting to see how influence marketing evolves, because as they become more and more sort of inclined to ensure that they are part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Awesome. And then I think we have time for one last question, which asks for some of your advice. What are your top tips for a successful career in PR, and how did you initially build your expertise?
So I think I started it off, I started in PR 10 years ago. I was so naive. I sort of, I was doing tax returns for 10 years, and I thought, and the only PR person I knew was Eddie from Absolutely Fabulous, just from watching her on TV. And I thought that looks a bit like fun. And I just wanted to do the extreme opposite to accounting. And so I sort of went in 10 years ago, and it's been a really hard 10 years because I've never worked in a PR agency. I've never worked in PR. And I had to sort of teach myself. And I think my sort of, my knowledge really accelerated when I joined the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, because actually, and the PRCA, both of them, we're so lucky to have 2 industry bodies that all of a sudden they had a structured, CPD, and they had, lots of, online material to learn, be it sort of videos or webinars, and then I met a lot of other fellow PRs, and I generally found the public relations industry incredibly welcoming and warm, and I think there is a bit of a community there that I've tapped into anyway. So I'd say really to network with your peers, join the industry body, professionalize. I think that's a really critical part of public relations because it moves so quickly and so fast. And I have sadly seen a digital divide where PRs, if they don't keep up with the latest communication channels and what's happening, they become increasingly redundant. So we have to really, what I love about the industry bodies is the CPD, that we have to constantly learn because there's new channels all the time. And because of COVID, all of a sudden, we had to learn how to do podcasts and how to do, sort of virtual events. And if you don't keep up with all the, the evolving communication channels, then you're going to become increasingly sort of redundant. And I think in an industry that's so fast moving like PR, you really have to have continuous learning. So I take a day a week where I just read and I just learn. And that's usually my Fridays. And I absolutely love the industry because it's fast moving and because you have such an opportunity to learn. And so that would be my my tip is build in your calendar, block it out a day or half a day, just to learn, just to be curious, just to Google the hell out of something.
I love it. Thank you so much, Farzana, for such an epic presentation and for all of your answers to our questions.